So thanks so much, all of you, for joining us for this Dialogue and Development session, which is part of a series. Oh, this is going to give us this sort of funny sense.
It's called the Wimbledon effect.
The Wimbledon effect in the wintertime. So it's part of a series which is this year to commemorate the 70 years of DPU. My name is Barbara Niket, and I'm teaching here at the DP. I'm a professor in urban development planning. So tonight's session is really to look at and unpack the history a little bit of the DPU with regards to urban transport planning in low and middle income countries. And it's a topic that is becoming increasingly urgent in the context of growing and increasingly unequal cities, and the no less growing threat of climate change and biodiversity loss. And a topic, of course, of major importance because transport infrastructure is represents such an enormous cost, and also because of its capacity to shape urban morphologies and urban trajectories in the long term, in the longue durée. So right now I'm going to give you a little bit of the history of DPU's work in transport planning, which spans just over 40 years. And actually, thanks to my colleagues, I've discovered bits of the DPU history that I wasn't so familiar with. So thank you for this. So the DPU's work in the field started in 1980 with a short course on urban traffic and transport planning in developing countries, which was set up and run by a colleague, Harry Dimitriou, who was then at the DPU, then moved to BSP, and then by Kasim Dalvi. So the course effectively initiated what became the long-standing process or project of the DPU, which is to question and interrogate the field of urban transport planning, which at the time was still pretty much dominated by a rather US or United States of America focus, and to sort of explore what might be some of the implications of this and how it might need to be rethought in the context of Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. Aha! We have Nick has arrived. Fantastic. So this was 1980 with his first short course. Another milestone at the time was DPU's work in development an MSc teaching to address the transport challenges in rapidly urbanizing Indonesia. So there were a number of specifically Indonesia-focused training programs. One was developed by the late Michael Safier, a DPU alumnus, if they can be, a grand person for DPU, Harry Dimitriou again, Martin Snaith from Birmingham University. They produced a feasibility study for the establishment of a master's degree on highway planning and engineering for development for the Institute of Technology in Bandung. This was also followed by the development of a syllabus in urban transport and traffic planning and management for the Ministry of Communications in Indonesia again. The DPU's work continued then afterwards in the field through PhD supervision. And the next big step was really in the 1990 with Karen, who published a first groundbreaking work on gender and transport, so starting to expand the field of transport. And in the late 90s and early 2000s, Julio sort of led a number of research initiatives that were focused on transport research projects in Latin America mainly, and specifically focusing on mobility innovations, such as the cable cars, which many of you will probably be familiar with, in particular the one in Medellin. In 2011, the DPU transport team was augmented with the arrival of Daniel Oviedo here, who started as a PhD student with Julio and then became, of course, a fully fledged and important member of the DPU community. In the 2010 onwards, the DPU expanded its research portfolio on transport planning, working with partners in UCL. So we have some here. We have Nick Tyler here. We have Helena Theodoridge, who is not here, but we have Clémence Cavoli, and also here, and also Peter Jones. And they are from the Department of Civil Environment and Geomatics or Engineering. and other partnerships in the UK and internationally. The initial focus was Latin America, but expanded and increasingly now focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. In 2016, Daniel and Karen started an MSc module on transport equity and urban mobility at the DPU, which is for DPU students, but also beyond in the Bartlett, and I'm sure some of you here will have attended that module, will have learned from that module. In 2017, Julio and Daniel were part of the founding team of the International Network for Transport and Accessibility in Low-Income Communities, which is an international partnership with 25 partner organizations and more than 300 individual members, mainly focused on sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. In 2018, Daniel founded the Latin American branch of this network, along colleagues at the DPU and beyond, Natalia Villamizar, Anna Ardila, and Anna Ardila. So I'm going to skip a few more of these because the list could be endless, just to basically, hopefully you will get a sense of the more than 40 years of DPU involvement in the field, and really what we'll be exploring tonight is the way in which this involvement has sought to expand the field, and in particular infuse the field with a lens of urban justice, a focus on addressing urban poverty, urban equality, and transport justice. So tonight we are going to have inputs from 3 of my fantastic colleagues at the DPU, and then we'll have a response from Nick before opening to your comments and your thoughts and reflections and questions. So what I will do now is introduce each of the speakers in turn with a short biography, and then we'll move forward. So the first speaker tonight is Karen Levy, Professor of Transformative Urban Planning. Transformative urban development, actually, much broader, and that's the whole point, is that, Karen, that's the point, is it's actually quite difficult to summarize Karen's contribution. So here we're going to zoom onto her contribution to transport. She is an urban planning and economist by background. She started her work on transport in the 1970s and early 80s, when I didn't know that, but she documented transport planning practices in relation to bicycle planning in the UK. There we go. In the early 90s, Karen explored the treatment of gender equality in the cities and urban areas in the Global South, and has brought this analytical lens to her thinking of transport planning. Since the 2000s, she's worked with Julio and Daniel on a range of transport research projects, and the introduction of this, of course, very important module on transport equity in the MSc Urban Development Planning at the DPU. This evening, she will present key ideas and assumptions that constitute conventional transport planning that she and the DPU team think are absolutely necessary to challenge and to uphold if we are going to be pursuing urban equality and transport justice. So thank you very much, Karen.
Thank you.
Maybe you can just leave that here. Yes, I think so. It would not be helped.
Thank you so much, Barbara. And good evening, everyone. And I'll do my best to keep my range of vision in this room. As Barbara said, in this session, I want to talk about some of the big ideas that have influenced the way we work as a team in the DPU. And there's much that I could say about what I inherited from the DPU's early work on transport planning. But for the purposes of this session, I'm just going to single out 2 of these issues that stimulated certainly my thinking about transport in my early work. The first relates to the argument that Barbara's already pointed to, that strongly argued contention by my colleagues at the time that imposing a transport planning discipline that came from and was based on experience in US cities, on very different cities in the Global South, was wholly inappropriate. and therefore needed another way of looking at this. The second relates to the commitment of my predecessors, and again repeat what Barbara says, to address questions of poverty in cities in the global south. And from the point of view of transport, their argument was that this required a shift in emphasis of transport planning from mobility to accessibility, which at the time, in the late 70s and 80s, was a point of debate. Both these concerns were foundational when I began my work in the early 1990s, at that time exploring gender in transport planning. And over time, these contentions have stimulated different lines of argument about the very foundations of the transport planning tradition. For a start, working with a gender perspective demanded the adoption of what today we would call an intersectional lens. It's a lens to examine transport provision and accessibility in the city, which focused not just on class, in other words, questions of poverty, but also focused on gender and its intersection with other social identities like ethnicity, race, religion, age, disability, and sexuality. This prism led us to a fundamental questioning of what were often hidden assumptions in transport planning. In other words, they were somehow naturalized in the way transport planning was organized and practiced. And these assumptions had to do with who was using what kind of transport, at what time, for what purpose, and to what locations in the city. In other words, pretty basic things that most transport planners want to know. For example, the emphasis on the journey to work in transport planning was based on assumptions about the breadwinner and the head of household being a man, and that the journey to work would be undertaken, a very big emphasis on the private car, and that the place of that work would probably be in the formal economy. And I don't want to dwell on the fallacies of these assumptions in the context of the cities of the global south, but suffice it to say, they were very problematic assumptions. They didn't reflect actually the empirical reality of many men and women's lives in different parts of the world. And I would go as far as to say they didn't even reflect the lives of many people living in London, New York, and Paris either. Indeed, such fundamental assumptions can be traced back to colonial times, rooted in colonial legacies of a transport system that supported extractive colonial economies and a transport expertise that was presented as top-down and technical. And clearly, it was clear to all of us working with this issue that there was an urgent need to reframe this entire notion of what were very fundamental assumptions in the discipline. Along with my other work on urban development planning, it also became clear that there was an urgent need to explore alternative approaches to the liberal and more recent neoliberal and behavioral approaches that dominated the way that the traditional transport discipline understood both planning and the city. Clearly, those two things are very closely related. And here the work of writers like David Harvey, Tim Creswell, Tanupriya Uteng, feminist geographers, and ecofeminists like Vandana Shiva were powerful contributors to the development of this alternative view. They brought the argument back to the question of power relations in society. The common thread in each was the importance of recognizing the way in which intersecting power relations shape human settlements, the local and global relationships between and within them, as well as in the range of urban practices seeking to make things better. Okay, urban practices that included planning itself, but also extended to private sector actions and to community mobilizations. In essence, what this meant was replacing a largely behavioral underpinning of transport planning with an understanding of intersecting power relations and their articulation in the systems of consumption, production, and distribution in the city, and deepening the understanding of the role of transport and transport planning in the production and reproduction of inequalities in the city. In other words, transport was far from the neutral or automatically progressive force that was posited by so many development practitioners, certainly in the 50s and 60s. The development of this view has permeated our work over the last 20 years, and in particular, I've argued for the recognition of what I call deep distributional questions affecting travel in cities, and the need to reframe one of the core concepts in transport planning itself, the notion of travel choice. What I'm arguing here is that it's very important to recognize that travel users come with their own social identities. They don't come in without attachment to who they are, their social position. And because of their social position, this often means that actually travel choice isn't optimal, as neoliberal economics would like us to believe. But it's often contingent, and it often results in inequalities for different kinds of people depending on their social position. It also has led us to the very crucial need, and many other people as well in the field of geography, to challenge liberal understandings of urban space itself. In other words, urban space, and I include in that the corridors and the hub of transport, shifting it from behavioral notions of space as a container to space as relational. In other words, imbued with power and thus giving space its political, economic, and socio-cultural significance. Based on these conceptions, I've argued for a reconstruction in the understanding of urban mobility as the freedom and right of all citizens to move in public space with safety and security and without censure and social control. An important part of this work was the formulation of a placeholder definition of transport justice itself, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But this is then drawing on and based on work of thinkers like Amartya Sen, feminist political scientists like Iris Marion Young and Nancy Fraser, and those advocates from the Global South promoting the right to the city. One of the key components of that definition is the right of all citizens in all their diversity to actively participate in the decisions that affect their cities and affect their lives. This implies moving beyond passive mechanisms of consultation. I think transport planning of all the planning disciplines has been very good at doing surveys and carrying out widespread surveys. In fact, been responsible for actually being, I think, the first users of the computer to collate a mass of information. The problem is, how useful is that information if it actually distorts the reality of people's lives? And so the argument is then for a large group of people to really knock on the door of transport expertise and to say, open up and let's start talking to people themselves. Okay, this is not new in other planning disciplines, but it has come rather late to transport planning. I think that what's important is here that in some, these different positions have led to the politicization of transport planning expertise in the way that it's understood, in the way that it's practiced, and in the way that it's imagined the city. In other words, responding to questions like, what kind of city do we want? And therefore, what kind of transport system do we need? I think that that kind of approach to transport planning is a very far cry from the traditional transport planning that we had in the 50s and 60s and continues today in different kinds of practices in different places. Ultimately, this led to the fundamental questioning of the often naturalized goal of transport planning as generating economic growth. You often hear the two spoken together. And we see in the budgets of national governments and the World Bank just how much they're committed to that goal of thinking about this connection between transport planning and economic growth. Now, I would argue that economic growth as an explicit and implicit goal of transport planning has begun to become discredited, not only because of the failure of the trickle-down approach to economic growth in many different fields, but also because of the increasing recognition of actually the nature of transport itself, that complex feedback loop, inaccessibility of what transport does, between this relationship between transport and development. You might get from A to B, but the minute you open up any route from A to B, then A also becomes more accessible, just like B becomes more accessible. So we have this kind of double feedback loop, which actually is quite a complex process to work on. It also has become increasingly discredited, as Barbara started to say, certainly from the 1970s onward, because of the negative impacts of transport on the environment and on health. And the urgent challenge today to address climate change and environmental health in the way that we understand and practice transport planning. And here I would say we need to include in this discussion both the green and the brown agenda in this discussion. So to end, I just want to end up with how we have started to operationalize this notion of transport justice based on the positions that I've outlined. And I call this a placeholder definition, because that's what it is. It's a definition even in its own lifetime that has changed, and it will continue to change and grow as we do more work. But we're talking about 4 dimensions of social justice here. We're talking about a transport system that ensures equitable access and mobility for all citizens in a sustainable manner. So the equitable distribution, which is very much linked to previous approaches to transport planning. But the work of Nancy Fraser and Iris Marion Young has also focused us on the whole notion of what I've called reciprocal recognition. A transport system and urban citizenry that recognizes different social identities and the environment in the way it plans, manages, and operates. In other words, we don't see populations as homogeneous, but recognize their diversity and work with that diversity, which will challenge many of the methods, the traditional methods that have been used. The third dimension relates to the parity political participation, and here we're talking about a transport system that actively engages all citizens and their representatives in the deliberations and the decisions about the current and future city and its transport system. And finally, a transport system in terms of mutual care and solidarity, a transport system that prioritizes mutual support and relational responsibilities between urban citizens and between urban citizens and nature, and actively nurtures the civic life of the city. So this is a sort of a notion that we're working with more and more in different ways. And although my colleagues, Danielle and Julio coming next, may not refer specifically to each of these, you will find reference to this kind of thinking in what they present to you, which will be quite specific and contextual. In other words, placed in a geography rather than in a set of ideas. So thank you so much.
so much, Karen, for this fantastic overview. And that challenge really to politicize transport planning and to highlight its transformative potential and its capacity to participate to the creation of more just and healthy cities, and not just cities of economic production, I think. So our next speaker is going to be Julio Davila, Professor of Urban Policy and International Development at the DPU. Julio is a civil engineer, development planner, and urban economist with experience in research in a number of countries in Latin America, Middle East, and Asia, and Africa. His research focuses specifically on local government in progressive and social political transformation. He's also explored the governance of urban and peri-urban infrastructures with regard to transport, water and sanitation, and rapid urbanization and health. He's a fellow of the Institute of Civil Engineers in the UK. And tonight, Julio will argue that urban transport has been a central organizing variable in modern cities, as well as a factor influencing both well-being and socioeconomic inequalities. And he will illustrate this largely with examples from Latin America. Right? Okay.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you very much, and good evening to everybody. Delighted to see such a large crowd. We don't have enough chairs for everybody, so that's a fabulous expression of, I don't know, solidarity, love, interest, who knows. But as Karen rightly says, what I'm going to do is hopefully sort of fit in all massive things in the 12 minutes or so that have been allocated. And it will, to a large extent, illustrate what Karen says. So I'm taking this to specific geographical space, which is Latin America. And to a large extent, I'm focusing also on one of the issues that Karen mentioned in her fabulous sweep of all the theories behind that, which is the links between land use and transport. I'll do that by looking at theory, but also looking at things that are specific to Latin America, namely the use of modernist planning, which was sort of used in many ways as a tool of planning, but also as a tool of spatial segregation, as you will see forward. And I look back before that at the history of Latin America. So those of you who are familiar with Latin America will know that it's the most urbanized continent, with about 81%, which shows very great divergences between the least urbanized in Central America and the more urbanized, like Uruguay and Argentina. But also the other feature in Latin America is the enormous socioeconomic inequalities, which are just featured there very quickly using one measure of income inequality, which is the Gini coefficient. Anything above 50 is massively unequal, and Latin America is a leader in that sense. Now, we need to go back to history, because when it comes to cities and spatial development, there's huge inertia. And what happened was, for those of you who are not familiar with the history of Latin America was had been inhabited for thousands of years. There's fabulous evidence of how very, very sophisticated, including pre-Inca and pre-Aztec civilizations were there, including in the Amazon, of which now we're finding, or archaeologists are finding, evidence of cities in the Amazon, which were completely wiped out, largely through the illnesses that the Europeans imported. But then it was occupied by the Spanish and subsequently in Brazil, particularly Portuguese colonizers, who were Christian. And they had been fighting a 500-year war against the Islamic, what they regarded as invaders. The Muslims brought in from North Africa and Syria. They brought in fabulous advances in science and so on, but they were not of the right religion. And this is the mindset that arrived in Latin America, is that of a crusade for Christianity. And to a large extent, that actually permeated a lot of what came afterwards. That was a sense of cultural superiority, I would say inferiority, in the sense that they felt that they had been oppressed by the Islamic superior colonizers for a long time, and this was an opportunity to take it on what they regarded as weaker populations, and they sort of disregarded completely the existence of any culture in Latin America. to a large extent. So there's a history. The second feature of this is that they colonized Latin America based on cities, which are using sort of old plans and old ideas that actually can be traced back to the Roman occupation of the Iberian Peninsula. And in many ways, when you look at a map like this one, which was 16th century map, all the cities in Latin America had Christian names and, of course, Iberian names. Now, to what illustrate one area that Karen touched upon, which is how do we explain that link between the concentration of cities and transport? And there's an old model which has been very influential in urban economics, particularly new urban economics, which you can trace back to von Thunen, who was an aristocrat who knew a lot of things. There was a sort of a Renaissance man at the beginning of the 19th century, but he created the model which you see there in a simplified way, that in a homogeneous flat region, agriculturist producers complete to locate as close as possible to the market for their produce. Very simple thing which worked very well in Germany because it's a largely flat country. And effectively what he said is land prices, or people who sort of adopted this, land prices will grow in relation to, in correlation with proximity to that market. Now, this was updated in the 1960s, 50s and 60s by people like Alonso in 1964 and applied to US urban communities. So instead of looking at agricultural production, Alonso and others said, well, actually, demand for locations close to a city center where jobs and other opportunities are located, it means that land prices will rise in relation to the distance to that. So the closer you are to that concentration, the higher the land prices. This model has been described by Arnott as generating important and robust insights into the effects of accessibility on urban spatial structure. And it's been, it essentially is based on a general Pareto equilibrium model to which you can add other models of different markets. So it sort of works pretty well if you're going to explain phenomena like suburbanization in the US. Now, the issue is, does it work in Latin America? And this tenet of the new urban economics, which you can read in sort of basic urban economics texts, I would argue, sort of following on what Karen was saying, Latin America needs kind of different explanations. We need to look at history, we need to look at class, we need to look at inequalities. So we need to draw on other traditions, of scholarly traditions, which are not just urban economics and transport planning. For example, to explain how does urban form work, right? What influence does topography have? When you have the Andes, which have very massive differences in high distance, and it's very dramatic, as you can see in this picture lower there, which is not the Andes, that is Belo Horizonte. Vehicle ownership patterns, socioeconomic factors, land ownership structures. Of course, the fact that landowners are able to command prices on the basis of the power that they hold over land is an important explanatory variable, etc., etc. And then expanded on the basis of, for example, trade policies. Are cars being imported? Duties low enough for the middle class to consume cars, etc. Now, the other important theoretical dimension which you need to apply or lens that you need to apply to understanding Latin America is in several large cities, not quite Mexico City, but many others, including Bogota and Sao Paulo and Santiago. The principles or tenets of modernist planning, which of course had the roots in European post-war, sort of just before the war, but especially post-war urban development, were applied there because they were attractive, because they augured, the new modern city based on the car, which was seen as progress. And modernism, for those of you who are not familiar with the history of planning, essentially identified land uses and strictly identified land uses which were spatially separated along four functions: dwelling, work, leisure, and transport infrastructure. Now, this was applied not in the scale that Le Corbusier and his colleagues wanted, but in bits and pieces in Latin America. And here I have my copy of Le Corbusier's Principios de Urbanismo, which is of course initially written in French. But Diane Davis, who's based in Harvard, argues that with industrial progress being the intended aim, because this was a tool for industrial progress, which was the way for development to happen. Oh my goodness, okay. Modernist plans prioritize the needs of industry and its workers in redesigning the urban fabric, while also privileging the role of transport to ensure the efficient mobility of goods and people. Now, that didn't quite work. It sort of fell flat in its face because there wasn't enough political will, but also not enough resources to do so. So effectively what happened is these tools were used partially as land uses to segregate cities. According to these principles, what they ended up doing was in the face of rapid urbanization, as there were structural changes, violence and poverty in rural areas, people sort of moved to the cities in migration levels that had never been seen before until China many decades later. And it gave result to informal settlements that many of you are familiar with. At the same time, globalization and the rise of a middle class meant that middle classes could actually start buying cars. And they started moving out in the way that American cities, households had done before. And so the transport planning response was to invest in road infrastructure with higher planned, at least, average speeds. So the argument is that you can make, except in places like Sao Paulo, and there are very interesting papers around that, in the absence of commuter rail, speed increases translated into longer travel distances rather than shorter travel times. So effectively, people were stuck in traffic. And this resulted in urban sprawl and technological lock-ins into high carbon transport technologies, which no amount of electric vehicles will reverse. This resulted in massive amounts of consumption of land, and you can see the figures there. And you see Mexico City has stayed largely stable, but places like Buenos Aires and Rio de Janeiro consume massive amount of land. This is interesting work by Cruz Munoz. And work that Daniel has been involved in, and no doubt he will explore a little more later, shows very clearly in the case of Bogota, for example, in the map on the left, that average income is lower in the south of the city, and it's there that people have longer commuting times. So it's cities that are spatially segregated. So there also very interesting work done by Hernández and de los Santos in a book that Daniel was one of the co-editors, and Valentina Montoya and colleagues, about how women, and it illustrates again what Karen was arguing about, we need to look at that intersectionality. So women tend to have longer commutes in terms of time, even though they're shorter periods. And actually Valentina has done a fabulous film, but also written work, showing that domestic workers in Bogota, for example, have the longest commutes of all workers. Very, very interesting work. And I'm nearly there, finishing. So effectively what happens is the poor are anchored in one place because they don't have the income to move. The daily journey includes long walks for millions of people, which Daniel will probably illustrate in a minute. And effectively, physical marginality, when you're constrained to being in the suburbs, in the distant locations, turns into social and economic marginality because you're away from everything, you're away from opportunities, essentially. And that's what places transport at the very center of development issues. But there are cities, and I'm always an optimist. I always like to look at the glass half full rather than half empty, and look at what can we do. I don't like just doing analysis and saying, oh, it's all terrible, and then throwing your hands up and then despair. Let's look at what is being done. And I think one case that I've been looking at for many, many years is the case of Medellin that Barbara mentioned. And what Medellin has done, it's a city with lots of troubles of all kinds, social and violence and so on. But they've done things right within their sphere, which is they've tried to aim for multimodality. In other words, right modes of transfer for different locations and different people. And that's what spurred me to study the cable cars, which are there on the right-hand side of, which are essentially the first, with Nick, and we did sort of very interesting work around this. What this shows, and Karen, of course, and Danielle, what this shows is that you can actually design modes of transport or use existing technologies to actually tailor-made them or adapt them to specific social, topographic, and urban realities. The other one which you're familiar with is this idea that you can actually pedestrianize cities, you can actually provide non-motorized transport. Ciclovía recreativa, that some of you who are familiar with Latin America will know, it's been going on for decades. In the 1960s, Bogotá has one of the longest one running since 1975, and it's also the most extensive. And finally, you can actually also do something which is unthinkable, but it's in a way it's a planning tool, and it's not necessarily a transport tool, but there are transport connections to that, which is to create new parks. And a very controversial example is one of the in Bogotá, in an area which was very deteriorated. You can see the picture on the left, which turned into this massive Transmilenio park, and this is a recent picture. So just to finish, Madame, yes, I'm arguing, to summarize, historical legacies are important. We need to look at context, we look at history, as Karen was arguing. Now, the one question to explore for you scholars is, are land use planners subject to greater pressures from the market than transport planners? To what extent are transport planners a little more independent than land use planners? And there's very interesting literature coming out in Latin America about land use planners, not so much at transport planners. These professional silos between urban transport planners and other planners are a problem, I think. There, again, interesting research coming out about the middle classes and their role in what is known in Latin America as the judicialization of planning. Again, at least 15 years old, but more recently done, especially by urban geographers. And we, as Maria Jose, who's just left the room, I think. She's gone. Anyway, as her work as a PhD student of ours is doing, we need to rethink the formal-informal dichotomy, and look at the nuances in the whole spectrum. Anyway, thank you for that. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julio. Thank you also for the really challenging questions. I hope you're all making note of them and coming up with comments for the for the discussion time. Really great inputs on. It's okay. Thank you. On the ways in which transport planning can participate to this revision of planning that we're all calling for from a southern lens, and with some really interesting questions that you raised here. So I'm going to move now to Daniel, who is preparing his slides. Well, I still have a few words to say about Daniel. Okay, good. Daniel, who is associate professor at the DPU, and he is also a civil engineer by background, are two at the DPU, with an MSc in transport engineering and planning and a PhD in development planning from the DPU. He's worked since 2009 on transport planning, first as a researcher at Universidad de los Andes and then at the DPU, when he joined in 2011, as we heard, as a PhD student, and now very much central to our teaching team at the DPU, teaching and research team. He's been working with Julio and Karen on a number of research projects to explore transport and well-being, transitions to sustainable urban mobility, transport and social inclusion, and the intersections between transport and health in various geographies. Since 2003, Daniel leads the On the Way to School project, which explores the links between active travel, health and well-being in adolescents in Colombia and Mozambique. And tonight, when we can get the slides up and running, Daniel is going to be building on his experience to reflect on the pathways for achieving more equitable transport through research and co-production with communities and policy workers. So we're engaging more in the methodology dimension at this stage.
So Personal announcement before we start, because this is a first for me, because my mom's here. So it's the first time that I'm going to make a public speech in front of my mom. Thank you for coming. Now, so where do we go from here? And what I wanted was to build on a few of our research insights to sort of locate, in terms of our work, what Karen and Julio have so eloquently put. And the first thing, why do we work on transport? At least, why do we work on transport DPU? Is because we are at crossroads, and this is coming from work that we have done with our colleagues in CG, including Clem here. Because countries in the lower end of the income distribution are at a point where we haven't made all the mistakes that were made elsewhere, where those car-oriented, heavy carbon technologies, I didn't do anything. Where all those high carbon technologies were consolidated into something that was very difficult and sort of became this sort of the trend that we see in countries in North America. But we also work in transport because when we look at the distribution of social, spatial, and economic differences, at the governance, which is something that Julio was alluding to, at the urban structures, that is something that consolidates over time, and the planning principles and practices that Karen was criticizing at the beginning, we have very strong distribution effects, and we need to address them because there are high inequalities. We also work on transport because we have high inequalities in terms of what do we know and where do we know about. So you see here a map of every country that doesn't have a single paper on walking research in Latin America. So that's where we don't know anything about walking. We also work on transport because people suffer from transport, particularly women. So we have here an excerpt from an interview in Maputo, where a woman said that the only way that she feels safe walking at night is with the keys in the middle of her hands as a weapon. We work on transport because transport affects health, and it's something that Karen was saying at the end, and it affects it in very different ways. So it touches on almost every one of the social determinants of health, and I'm not going to stop to explain that. And we also work on transport because transport is highly political. So what it says here is that we need a dignified service that gets us to our jobs, just to begin with. And of course, we need to think about care, we need to think about other types of mobilities. So at the DPU, we have been working for 44 years, and I did an exercise of mapping every country we have worked in at least once for a project. We still have much of the world to cover, but as you can see, we have built greatly on our expertise in Latin America, and fortunately we have many people here who could have a conversation in Spanish around transport. But we're also moving, as Barbara put it, increasingly towards Sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the global south. But we're also working in the global north. We're also questioning the inequalities that come from migration, that come from diverse identities in the global north. But it's not just about where do we work, but who do we work with? And some of the examples that we have here, this is from our research on walkability. We have established partnerships with research organizations, with NGOs, with different universities that don't necessarily need to rank highest in the international rankings, because that's not what's most important about building partnerships. We work with many researchers and we have built networks, which is something that Barbara was mentioning earlier. Is our International Network for Transport and Accessibility. It's a mouthful, just call it Interlink. And we've tried to fill some of those gaps based on where people are. And this is an example from our On the Way to School project, where we are doing something different, which is using medical research funding to try to look at these inequalities and try to build something. So we're moving into action research, into implementation research, to try to change some of the things, or try to amplify the effect of the things that work, or at least that we believe that works. So in our work, and this is some of what Julio was looking at, we look from the bird's eye view at what transport does. And what it does is that it reinforces inequalities. So this is a different map of Bogota, what Julio presented, one that shows densities. On the right-hand side, you see the density of population. On the left-hand side, you see the density of employment, and you see that they are completely opposite to each other. So everyone is traveling in the same direction, and that's how we plan for transport. So it comes as no surprise that our insignia of transport innovation, which is the BRT, was first built towards where there was highest density, but of people who were of higher income, if you remember, of Julio's presentation. And then Perhaps 13 years later, we managed to get to the south, where we had most of the poor, and you have the highest density of population. So we look at it from the sky, and this is Maria Alejandra's first attempt at operating a drone, so you will forgive. But then we also need to look at it from the ground to understand what are the dynamics and the experiences of people who are, in this case, traveling by bicycle as a group. We need to understand how different interactions happen in the space, and what we have been trying to do is to literally put everyone at the eye level of the children that we are working with. Because the experience, as Karen put it, is differentiated. We cannot assume that everyone has the same identity and they carry the same conditions to work on transport. And we started working in different places, such as the Bahamas. And you will imagine, well, why is the DPU working in a high-income country? Because it's one of the countries with the highest rates of motorization or private car dependency, as well as the second country in the world in terms of diabetes and coronary disease. And it's somewhere where planners decided that it made complete sense to raise the level of the road, so when it rains, the children have to go on puddles to be able to access the school. And that was something that for them made sense. So when this rains, this disappears and the school is here. And yes, there was a crossing, but it was nowhere near useful. But we also started working with those who are working on transport, and here we have a very amused photo of them. In Freetown, where we were trying to come up together with visions for the future. And perhaps nobody had asked people in Freetown, especially those working at the Ministry of Transport, how were they imagining the future of Freetown? And we did, and we brought an artist who painted a vision of a different Freetown, perhaps with many of the biases that we have learned in our training, but in a way trying to see differently what transport was. Sorry, I'm trying to count my own time. But then we don't only ask what are the ingredients of that vision. We try to connect it with the same frameworks that Karen and Julio have mentioned, and we try to translate it into our methods. So many of our methods are a mix of everything that we've learned throughout these 44 years, which include not only looking at it from the bird's eye view, not only creating and filling gaps in evidence, through imagery, through participatory methods, through community mapping, through local partnerships, but also to start thinking about how do we make this reproducible. So coming up with open source codes, holding international workshops in different languages, trying to build engagement, and having outputs that are actually readable for policymakers, and then trying to make this something that builds capacity. So we're trying to engage with communities, but also, which is one of the strengths of the DPU, engaging with communities, engaging with policymakers, but because of what Karen was saying earlier, we need to engage with the technical experts of transport to break the black boxing. Yeah, I'm going to finish in 5 hours. But then we're also asking uncomfortable questions. So this is a photo that Orlando, our photographer today, took of me, because we were hungry and because we went out drinking in Bahamas. There was no Wendy's. Wendy's was there, but it was closed for pedestrians. But it was open for the drive-thru. So we joined the queue on foot of the drive-thru. And then we presented it to people in a workshop at the Inter-American Development Bank, and we asked them, how did you get here? I could have asked them, if you wanted a Wendy's at midnight, how would you get there? And one of the questions is, could you have walked? And if not, why not? And that simple question, in many places in the Global South, gives you answers that might be terrifying. We also work on transport for engagement, yes, but to facilitate conversations. So these are photographs from a recent experience that we had in April with our colleagues from the On the Way to School program in Maputo, who came to Bogota not only to understand and to see the programs for themselves, but also to talk with their peers and to talk with children who could tell them better than anyone else how the program was benefiting them or not. And then we use all of that to engage at those 3 levels, with communities, with technical experts, with policymakers, trying to find meaning in what those things that we tend to overlook, such as walking. how can they be inserted in the planning system? We take them on a walk, very much literally. Our colleagues in Maputo, and Mercilia, one of our students here, she was working in that team at the moment, who invited policymakers and technical experts to actually walk. For some of them, it was the first time that they did. And I go back to the TISUM program because we use all of these to try to prioritize things that are urgent. So try to balance the urgent and the strategic, what's feasible versus what's a priority. And this is something that comes from our work in Sub-Saharan Africa. And then we invite them for conversations so they can pose very proud in front of the latest development bank's projects house. Because we talked about walking, because it was something that they had never done. And we make our work open access, so if you want, you can go into Mapillary and look at the neighborhoods that we have been working on. We also use the knowledge that we have been producing, such as mapping every light post that this community in Freetown put together, so they can use it for advocacy. So we try to use the knowledge to empower those who need it the most and those who know what they need most. And then we try to question all of these issues and to find opportunities in what people are doing or what NGOs are doing or what the government itself is doing, so we can use bottom-up action research to inform different practices. We also work with our partners in trying to document the big transformations that they have done. So this is a case from Maputo where our colleagues in Architecture Without Borders actually started opening streets, first of 2 meters, then of 3 meters, and we tried to look at what does this do. And this wasn't a transport intervention, it was an intervention about getting security of tenure. So we're bringing a different angle to that information. We're building capacity through our students, and I'm very glad to see many of you here. And hopefully we will see you in our module next term. And finally, we theorize. So I'm about to close, but this is something that we have been trying to do, is to understand from everything that comes from the lived reality, that comes from the bottom up, that comes from the top-down vision, into something that helps us understanding complex yet relatively simple things such as walking in a different way, and then trying to translate everything that we try to research into theory that can be reproducible. With that, I'm closing, but not without an invitation for you to look at what we're doing on the way to school. And because I don't have enough things to do, I'm also a podcaster. So I have a podcast in Spanish that speaks about many of these things. So that's the last thing that we do. We learn from our research to have conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and such a nice way of presenting all the current work that is being done with all these why, where, with whom, how, what for questions. And I'm looking at my students here to think this is such a nice way of communicating what you're doing, so incorporate this. And I also note, when I first working on transport at the DPU, there was all these people who were so into biking, and now everybody's walking, and so there's a trend. Maybe that's a question to explore in the question and answer. But for now, we're going to have a response, a first response from Nick Tyler. Nick Tyler, who is Chadwick Professor of Civil Engineering, the Department of Civil, Environment and Geographic Engineering here at UCL. He uses his background as a musician to combine highly diverse fields in his research and teaching, from science and engineering through to performing arts and policy. To do that better, or to consolidate that, he's created Pearl, which is a multi-scale, multi-sensorial person, environment, activity, research laboratory based in East London. Pearl examines the interactions of environment, people and their activities at a life scale. At UCL, Nick has also set up the UCL Accessibility Research Group within the Center for Transport Studies with a team of researchers who investigate many aspects of accessibility and public transport. He's a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, the Institution of Civil Engineers, the Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation, and the Chartered Institute of... So much. He was appointed CBE, that's very important, in 2011, and awarded the Chartered Institute of Highways and Transport Institution Award in 2022. And really, most importantly, he's been invited to reflect on this panel as a long time partner, a friend of the DPU, and of course a world leader in alternative ways to approach transport. So Nick, please come and join us. Thank you very much.
Gosh.
After all of this.
Gosh, yes, it's quite ironic. It's quite ironic, really. I'm the one with the job title of civil engineer, but I'm not a civil engineer. Yes, well, so response is really, I mean, first of all, I mean, 40 years fantastic stuff from DPU, and I don't really know why we had anybody else doing this work in the world, because DPU clearly does it extremely well. And I think, and it's always been a great privilege to learn from my colleagues in DPU about how this whole question of how people move around in situations where the kind of assumptions that we make in the global north, and especially in a place like London, simply don't apply. But actually, the mistake I think that transport planning, if we just take it as a whole, was kind of made is it rather started from the idea that in the global north and in cities like London and Washington and places like that is actually where the norm is, and that's what everybody should do. And what I have learned from my own experiences in Latin America and also working with people like Julio and Karen and Daniel, is that's actually the reverse of the truth, and that really the thing to do is to understand the raw truth of people moving, and that is what we do not do. And I think so. One thing, it's a sort of kind of response. One thing that I think is actually really important in this context is that we talk about transport, and we talk about and the transport planning and the let's go from A to B and let's do it at 8 o'clock in the morning, all that sort of stuff, and all of the things, all of the impositions that come, gender, class, socioeconomy, and all of those things. We talk about all of that from the perspective of transport, but actually it's not about transport. It's about how people live, it's about how people are, how people feel. And where is that in all of this? You know, and I think increasingly I'm trying to sort of get rid of the word transport. I like getting rid of words from time to time. I tried to get rid of the word teaching in UCL a long time ago because I said we shouldn't be teaching, we should be learning. And every year I used to cross out the word teaching on the departmental teaching and learning strategy, and every year they send it back. So somebody has defaced this. But anyway, so getting rid of words. So transport, why get rid of transport is because I think it focuses us on the means by which we impose a way of living on people that involves them actually getting in some vehicle and moving. Why do we do that? No, actually what we should be thinking about is how do we get people, not just individually, but people in the groups that form society, how do we get them to have a better life? Why do we have transport planning that we don't have sociality planning? Because actually Homo sapiens is a social species. We survived the last few catastrophes by virtue of the fact that we had the capability to initiate the communication, to initiate collaboration and cooperation. Right? If you move into the savannah, out of the jungle, you can't just go and pick berries off trees and things because there aren't any. You have to find an animal to eat, and those animals are pretty scarce and they're pretty big. So you need to cooperate. So the species that could actually cooperate is the one that survived. And that's in our genes. This is not just a nice fancy sort of theory. This is about the genetic reason that we are here. And everything that we do follows that. So why are we individualizing people? Why are we not actually creating the means by which we can exercise that sociality? And so I look at people like sort of Robin Dunbar and people like that, because it's interesting, because he talks about, whether his numbers are right or wrong is another question altogether, but he talks about this need for groups to work together and to solve, and how does that actually work. If you go and look at the indigenous tribes in North America, that's exactly what they do. That they don't have this sense of a hierarchy. They are looking at the fruitful usefulness of the outcome of a decision for the society, not do I gain from it. And I think these, you look at Maslow's hierarchy. It's very interesting, Maslow's hierarchy, because if I said to you what shape is Maslow's hierarchy, I guess most people would say it's a pyramid. Anybody say it's a pyramid? Yeah, most people say it's a pyramid. Yeah. That's not what Maslow wrote. It's really interesting, because where did that all come from? It came from, he spent 6 months or so living with the Blackfoot tribe, trying to find out how they determined how their community should live. And he came out with a sense of these are the things that they find are important. Things like sociality, community, esteem, respect, spirituality, honesty, shelter, food, water, things like that. And how that was actually determined in the tribe was that these were things that you attempted to attain kind of equally. And you got a bit more some days and a bit more than the other days and all this sort of stuff. And he drew it as a circle. And when he wanted to publish that, the publishers all refused to publish it because it came from the Blackfoot tribe. So it turned into a pyramid. And when it was a pyramid, they would publish it because it was hierarchical. You had an order, and that was proper. So even when we look at something which we kind of like Maslow, actually it's been distorted by somebody in the global north. It wasn't anywhere else, right? So whether it wasn't the global north, I don't know. But that sense of distorting the objective of what we're actually talking about underpins the way that we have tended to try and impose things like transport planning and mobility into the global south as being the next empire. And so what is really, I think, very informative in what we've heard this evening, from sort of almost 3 different levels of looking at this problem, is just how in the DPU work you have been able to extract from that and say, hang on a minute, this isn't right, we need to find another way. And I suppose in my response, I'm sort of getting more and more interested in looking at how does Homo sapiens survive. We didn't actually survive in order to get in a car, or even on a bicycle, right? And so if we want to survive, it's going to be because we can thrive. Sociality is crucial to that. We need others in order to survive. We cannot survive on our own, we need others. So therefore, our view of a city needs to comprise something which brings us together. And to what extent does mobility bring us together? Well, it packs us into tin cans, 7, 8, 9 people per square metre, which immediately sets up stress responses. So something which we're looking at the moment. Sets up stress responses which, in effect mean you're injecting yourself with diabetes sort of twice a day for 40 years or whatever it is. Not a very good thing to do. That's not what I would say is a mobility solution. And why are we moving? Why are we not actually doing more things more locally, more involved with our local grouping and our local society, so that we can actually thrive as a species, as human beings, in a planet that will help us survive. And instead, what we do is we get in something which kills both us and the planet. Every 24 seconds, a person dies on a road somewhere on the planet. There's another one. and somehow we've got this so distorted that we actually need, I think in the transport world, we kind of need to start saying, actually, instead of having the Centre for Transport Studies, we should have the Centre for Not Transport Studies. and we should be, how do we justify? We don't, it's a bit like having a centre for poison. We should be trying to figure out how we're not going to kill people, how we're not going to injure and maim people, how we're not going to destroy society. And then we can start to think about how can we actually enable that society to do the things which are not in their reach. So you do have to move. I'm not saying you shouldn't move anywhere, but I think we need to think very much more carefully about how we justify the way in which we organise our communal life in things like cities in order to make that survival possible. And so my sort of thought out of this is, and we've seen lots of examples of cities today, is we think of a city, London's 10 million people, Beijing 30 million people, and Tokyo, whatever it is, and all those huge numbers of people living in all these cities, and we start from that point and say, how am I going to move 30 million people? How am I going to move 10 million people? How am I, 2.5 million people cross the Circle Line every morning between 7 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And the whole transport system is designed to do that. And why? And so maybe we should start the other way around. How do we have a small communal group able to do the things that it wants to do and then interact with another one and interact with another one? How do they get, when we ask people, what would you like to have within walking distance of your home? A coffee bar, a bakery, occasionally a newsagent. And it was pretty similar all over the world. I mean, the detail would change. But it wasn't a factory, and it wasn't an office, and it was very simple things. And if you say, what about a shoe shop? Well, that's okay, I go there every so often, so that can be further away. So you can start to think about how you think of your city as being how we enable people to live and thrive, and then how you join that together. So you're kind of thinking it the other way up. And I think that, to me, is where, and we, as Karen, I think, said, let's break this concept that transport and economic growth they're just two evils in the same box, really. And they're not mixed. It's a bit of a con. And I think we need to think much harder about how our objective is to enable people to have a good quality of life with a sociality that enables us as a whole to have a good quality of life in the communities that we want to live in. And mobility is central to that, very much in the case of not going anywhere, but actually enabling people to move when they need to move, and not to use the movement as the objective, but as the piece that we need to do for other things. I think that's my response. That work is really good.
Fantastic, Nick. Thank you so much for this. Do you know the Centre for the Less Good Idea?
No.
That's a centre set up by William Kentridge.
All right, yeah.
Which is about supporting experimental collaborative projects, etc., within art space. So I will definitely put you in touch with it. But that's great. Fantastic provocations around how we need to rethink transport.
Can we rethink the equality of the room and move?
We are. Okay. Okay. So we're going to move this side. We'll move to panel mode, to panel and discussion mode.
Okay.
Well, we will.
Equitable distribution.
While we do that, start thinking about your ideas, your questions, your clarifications.
Okay.
Do we have enough?
I think.
Is that it? That's my little. And then And then I'll be wandering along with the microphone. You can help me with
We need microphones. There's two.
Are there two?
Yeah, another one.
Fantastic. So, Nick, please feel free to get. No, you don't need a chair. I'll stand. So please feel free to join here, and then question time or comments time. It can also be comments. It doesn't have to be questions only. Yes.
I think this would work at some point. Yeah, it's working.
Okay. My question is,
Please introduce yourself.
Oh.
Sorry, I forgot to say yes.
I'm Alex. I'm part of the Transport City Planning Master's Program in the BSP. A couple of us are here to listen to the talk, but yeah, thank you so much for the talk. It was really insightful. My question is in regards to talking about the global south or global versus the global north, and talking about transport planning in different contexts. What do you think is, or are the major differences when looking at the different contexts in the global south? Is the framework of transport planning, the goals of transport planning fundamentally different, or is it more about the implementation strategies or the discourse surrounding planning?
Thank you. I'm going to take a couple of questions so that you can see which one you want to pick up on.
Hi, I'm Fernanda. I'm a transport and city planning master's student, where I used to be the general director of Mexico City's public transport. So my question is the role of transport operators, because I think that social justice is not only for the users, but also the role of all these informal popular transport operators that they give like that first and last mile connection to massive transport. What's the perspective of DPU? Because I think that the structured transport perspective is more European American centered. And the informal role of the transport of two-wheelers or vans has an important role in the global south. So that might be my question.
Thank you. Any others for now?
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really interesting. I would like to know what do you think about this concept of 15-minute cities? Because it's complicated, I know, but it's like a concept that it's that it's taking so much popularity, especially in our context in Latin America. But we know it has challenges about, the possibility of more gentrification, and also in big cities as like Bogota or Medellin that has like a really located and centralized services. It is difficult also to talk about this kind of cities, so I would like to know more about your opinions about that. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to take these questions, and then I'm aware of time, so unless, one or two others maybe afterwards, who would like to answer?
I have a problem with the question. Let me put it that way, right? Because I think that we live in a world where the connections in the world are much more powerful than they ever were before. And we also live in a world where ideas travel. And that's part of the problem and part of the solution. When ideas travel and they are presented as somehow superior ideas, dominant ideas, and all ideas carry with them values, all ideas carry with them some foundational, they come from somewhere, right? And the problem with traveling ideas, and I'm talking about planning now, right? Because planning is a traveling idea, right? It didn't just start in the UK and Europe. It was very much part of a colonial inheritance. It was the way that colonial cities organized themselves. And a lot of what was learned in that period then got put into planning law, many of which many countries today are still coping with the consequences of that planning law. They haven't, in many cases, it hasn't even been updated properly. So we're still dealing with history as well as geography, and in that history and geography are systems of power of ideas. And so for me the question really is, what baggage does an idea come with? Because that's what we've got to understand. How useful is that idea to me now here? If I understand what the baggage is that it comes with, I've got a much better chance of using it well, or actually throwing it out, whichever we decide to do. So I think that it's not so clear to talk about the global north and the global south anymore. I think that the linkages, there are global, local, regional linkages, ideas traveling up and down and east and west and north and south. And what's important to look at is the ideas themselves, where they come from, what they hold, what's the history of them, and what are the assumptions behind them, to make visible those assumptions behind them. Then you can decide how useful they are to the situation that you would. And the problem is that planning wasn't done like that. The problem is it was just taken from one place, and it wasn't just any place, it was the global north, and it was planted in different places. And conditions were so different, and the assumptions were so problematic in those places, didn't make any sense. So it may be, as Julio implied, that there were aspirations towards the modernist city by many people, but at the same time the modernist city didn't sit well with the local situation. Yeah? And so it got changed and distorted, and it looked different. Yeah? It looked very different, actually, in the end. You can see all these gorgeous photographs of what Chandigarh and Brasilia used to look like when they first built them. And you look at them today and they have no relation. Nada. Okay? They are basically cities with a formal structure but an informal infill of people living. Yeah? So I think we need to loosen up a bit, yeah? and begin to question the so-called received wisdom that we're dealing with in our field. And with that, I will pass on to Daniel to talk about informal, formal transport systems, which is very much part of this whole story, but in a very specific way.
Not much choice there. You might have wanted to talk about the 15-minute city, but
you can do that as well.
I'll start with informality, because it's impossible to look at cities almost anywhere without looking at informal transport. I mean, you just need to go to Piccadilly to see the tricycles here in London. I mean, there are different ways in which transport has been configured, and many of those ways have been out of necessity, have been out of a system that, as we have argued tonight, it prioritizes wealth, it prioritizes power, it prioritizes the productive side of city, and then everything else gets disconnected. And what do people do? Well, there needs to come something. And Nick also alluded to it, because it wasn't about moving for the sake of moving, it was because we have a lot of fun in motorcycle taxis, especially when there is no roads to ride them, right? It's because there was a need to move, because the opportunity is there, thinking about the 15-minute city as well. They were not there. And if there was also another type of informality that was responding to it. So we cannot disconnect it from the role of people-led transport solutions. And they are solutions, but they are solutions that within their precarity become exploitative. There are solutions that within their limitations become more dangerous, perhaps, that they might be contributing to those 24 seconds because nobody decided to plan for a transport system that connected those areas that were also informally urbanized in the peripheries, in many cases, at least in our Latin American context. And thinking about the 15-minute city, I mean, if you look at who came up with the branding, because the accessibility literature has been there for a long time. And that accessibility literature since the 1950s has been saying we need to plan for proximity. The question is, how do we provide not only that proximity, but that mobility within that range? 15 minutes is just a number. It's about what do we need to access, as Nick was putting. And that's the question that we should be thinking about, because if you look at Bogota can be a 15-minute city, because if you just count and tick boxes, you can find that something that you need. The quality, the price, and the risk that you need to bear in order to get to that thing within 15 minutes is something different. And that's something we're going to discuss. I'm going to stop there because I think we're just jumping mics, so Julio,
Yes.
say
I
something.
don't have much to ask. I don't mean too eloquent. The only observation about the Moreno's concept of 15-minute cities, I don't think he understands cities. He's a mathematician, and I don't think he understands cities well. And you know, so it's in a way, it's an abstract concept which probably works very well in Paris, where they're trying. There's a particular political reason for doing this, which is a socialist mayor trying to reduce the power and presence of cars, and people getting killed, and pollution. But I honestly don't think he has an understanding of how cities work. Certainly, even though he's a Colombian professional, I don't think he understands how even cities in Latin America work well. Anyway, a little bit about.
Yeah, I'll just say something about 15-minute cities. I have a real problem with 15-minute cities. And the reason I have a real problem with 15-minute cities is that I think we should have 4-second cities. And why do I say 4-second cities? The reason it's 4 seconds is that one of the things that we've found is that it takes around about 4 seconds for somebody to greet another person. The whole sort of neurological process takes around about 4 seconds, approximately. And the heart of a city is people greeting each other. So can you design a city that enhances the capability of people to greet each other? Then you will actually have a better characterized city. So let's worry about people greeting each other before we worry about 15 minutes, because as Daniel said, it's a number. And I think if we were to think around that, the sorts of things that you find are really quite small and actually quite cheap. So some work we've been doing in Beirut, very difficult at the moment, of course, but where we've been working in Beirut with very constrained circumstances, trying to create places where people can exercise sociality, because people need to be able to talk to each other. And that often is just a question of changing the shape of a bench, so that the bench enables people sitting on it to be able to see somebody a slightly more easy eye contact. And then you find conversation. Does the bench face something that's interesting, or does it face something that isn't interesting? Those kinds of things. And then people use it and they become more conversational. And we've been doing this for a number of years in Beirut. And now, at this moment, the main area that we've been doing this in has been evacuated by about 90% of the population. And just last week, we had communication from them saying that when they go back to this area, would we be able to help them in creating the sociality? Because in their evacuation, what they had realized is they had kind of lost that sociality. And that was the thing, out of all of the difficulties that they were in, that was the thing that they were looking for. And that kind of leads me to think that actually, yes, that 4-second greeting process is what we should be looking for, because it's the little seed that starts everything else. And so I would argue for the 4-second city.
Thank you for that. This might be bigger on this one. Okay, one question and two, and then three. I have. Oh, gosh. Okay, very quickly, say what you have to say. And I'll, as chair, I need to leave. That's the only question. I have to be sociable.
Thank you all for a very interesting set of presentations. My name is Jana. I'm from Beirut, actually. And I did the transport and city planning course, and now I'm doing a PhD at Oxford. My question, I think, mostly to Daniel, is about theorizing, which you spoke about. What does it mean to theorize? If you can expand on that idea, especially the thought that I'm thinking about is we tend to enter these discussions based on theories from the global north, like transport-related social exclusion was theorized in the global north, and we enter through those entry points, and then we try to re-theorize. So what does it mean to theorize, and to what degree can we theorize from the global south when all the, or most of the literature is based in the global north, and even the literature that we are now producing starts there. And also, like, something that came up while I was listening is, to what degree are we able to also draw out, because the global south is not one place, and even the theories that we might be able to tap in there will be very different from place to place. So to what degree is that being acknowledged and recognized, given that we're in the UK studying the global south? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's a very small question for the end of the session. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Mercedes Lambe. I'm from Mozambique, and my question is, what are your thoughts on TOD, transit-oriented development, in a context where the public transportation, informal public transportation competes with the formal one, but also understanding that there's a precarity of the infrastructure that enables this mobility, and understanding that sometimes the state creates different types of organs that kind of complicates. For instance, in my country, an entity was created to manage parking and the bus stops and terminals, but their priority is not mobility, at least in my perspective, mobility in general. When it comes to active mobility, they are not promoting that. They're busy collecting money from the parking to eventually invest in public transportation and maintenance of those bus stops and terminals. And so I don't know if I made my question clear. What are your thoughts on TOD?
Thank you. There was a couple of, oh yes, there was one here and then one there.
Yeah, so Sophia, I'm in the BSP PhD planning, and my question is related to how do we research and how do we study new and innovative concepts and ideas when nothing has been studied before in that area, let's say Latin America. Or if we put it in other words, how do we solve specific and like these new problems when more basic ones haven't been addressed? For example, I did my dissertation on mobility and older people, and one of the main results was related to infrastructure. So first it was like, why are you focusing on older people if the problems that they have, like the whole population is having it while using the public transport? That's like one example to explore the question. Thank you.
Thank you. And last question, briefly put please.
Hello, I do the UDP program in DPU, and my question is about decentering transport from planning practice, or what Nick mentioned. I think a central tenet of mobility these days is speed. So how do you decenter transport in actual planning practice without slowing down the travel times? Because often it takes minutes and hours to get to places. I'm from Delhi, so everything's really far away. So how do you take transport out of the equation but find a better alternative that doesn't take as long?
It's not moving it, it's reframing it.
Star Trek. I want to come back on the question you asked. Now, obviously, as an institution in the global north dealing with cities in the global south, this is a question we ask ourselves all the time. And we're in the business of not just recognizing but analyzing very carefully and looking at the whole question of what I would call the unequal political economy of higher education and research in the world. And it's a very serious problem, and it's not one that's looked at properly yet, but there is a growing body of people who are. And there is a growing body of people who are very conscious of it and who are constantly trying to develop what some people refer to as the southern turn of work in the field. And transport, unfortunately, is a little bit far behind in joining that group, but there are other groups working in the development field who are very much part of it. And it involves us all, I would say, in a very important process of deconstructing academia in the global north and understanding the values and hierarchies of that endeavour. And also requires a lot of self-examination and a lot of questioning of the way in which resources, the way in which we understand good research, the way in which we understand what the values of academia. And I think that this is something that all of us are engaged in every way, and causes us, for example, to work on things like the co-production of knowledge, and in the most honest way and sincere way that we can, which is not always easy, because we are working in structures where there is an unequal political economy around funding of research, budgeting of research, the rules around where money goes and how the value of academia is measured, the whole REF exercise and how that's measured in this country relative to knowledge elsewhere. So I think this is a lifelong endeavour for any, I think, serious academic. Doesn't matter where you are in the world. It's something that I would argue you need to be fully engaged in, and to understand that when you are using theory, you know where it comes from, and you acknowledge that. In other words, what we need to do is we need to denaturalize. We have naturalized so many things as if they're just normal, as if they're just the way things are, and we need to really stop doing that and to start to question and denaturalize a lot of those assumptions that we make about academic life. And the whole, I would say you could almost call it an industry in a way, and the industry of academia. It's an industry of a different kind, but it operates in a very specific way. And the way in which theory is developed in that, I think, is very crucial, obviously, because it is a world of ideas and of education and of sharing ideas. And the question is, of course, for us, what's important in our work is not just the ideas, but also the pedagogies of dealing with those ideas and how they're conveyed. And we spend a lot of time looking at what we call critical pedagogies in that system. And so I think that my sadness is that transport as a discipline is very late in coming to that party. And it needs to buck up and arrive and be part of it, be part of that discussion in a much more fully fledged way.
Well, I have to. I'm going to try to add something to what Karen has said, which is very not much, but I think in terms of theorizing from the South, it's about not ignoring what we started with, which was a lack of knowledge and a lack of recognition of what people's lived experience, people's priorities, people's knowledges. We might come with some general framework and test whether or not it works. The reason why we use social exclusion theory was not because it came from the North. I mean, we need to recognize it, as Karen said, we take it with, perhaps not a pinch, perhaps with a lot of salt, because it lacks flavor sometimes. But with that, we use our methods, we use our dialogues, we change the way in which prioritize not the evidence that comes from the traditional household travel survey that perhaps fits a framework, or not even that one. And from there, we start abstracting and finding principles to work with, and not assuming that that's going to be the way in which it's going to play out everywhere. It comes with a warning, with a user warning. Perhaps that's what we need, a more of a user manual for our concepts. So how do we connect this with our methods, and how do we build from our methods to try to generate some sort of theory that makes sense for us to start understanding a problem, because that's what research is. We try to understand a problem that makes sense for us, so we can share it and other people can make sense of it, perhaps in a different way, and that's how we enrich each other. But it needs to come from that and from challenging that system, because we cannot keep saying that in terms of the diagram that I presented, we cannot keep saying that the absolute truth about how we understand walking came from a small research about Ghent with only quantitative work, right? But we need to stop being shy about our titles in the papers, for example, because that study about Ghent said this is a framework for walkability. And in the meantime, while you're working in countries such as Nigeria, which has thousands of people, reviewers are forcing you to put that the paper is about Nigeria and perhaps it's not relevant about anywhere else, or to put a note on it. So we need to challenge that. And I think that's the way in which we theorize. So it's more about principle, I would say, and about recognizing our methods and the knowledge that we are connecting with.
We're running out of time, and we've booked a table, and you need to go. so I don't. Just to acknowledge Celia, Sophia, and the UDP lady here. Very big questions, and we'll need a whole seminar, maybe a whole module to deal with them. Quickly, Sophia, if I understood your question right, how do we deal with innovative ideas when basic issues have been addressed? And it's an issue of establishing priorities. That's what you see. Priorities are generally established by politicians using certain frameworks, and a lot of these frameworks are actually imported from overseas, or respond to very specific class interests or group interests. And I think you should be afraid of challenge that, if I'm understanding your question well. I mean, if you do see an innovative idea and take Nick's framework of not talking about mobility or transport, but talking about well-being first. How do we make cities better for people? How do we make cities and people better for the planet? And I think that's a crucial dimension. We are screwing up. We are killing this planet. That's the only planet we know. And we're not going to move wherever Elon Musk says. We're not going to move or wholeheartedly somewhere to screw up another planet. So we've got to live with this one. So I think it's, in many ways, is recognizing the innovatives that are there, whether it's in communities or in local authorities, which is what we did with the work in Medellin, was actually, they were doing things without thinking what they were doing. And we, as an outsider, you come in as a researcher and look at these things and think, wow, this is doing amazing things, which they were not intended consequences. So you start to looking at them with a different framework, and that's what you bring in as a researcher, a training, an observation of different places, a set of values which you make explicit, and then you recognize the innovation there and how it can be used. And then you enter into a dialogue with the people who install these, the practitioners and the politicians, say, actually, if you tweak this in a certain way, this will actually reach more people, this will make people happier. This will will improve well-being. But it's that training that we as academics have that allows us to take distance and actually look at realities with a different angle. So yes, it's wonderful to enter into dialogues. I mean, we were talking with Laura today about how she is a practitioner. She's actually itching to go back to the work and doing it. Say, no, enjoy your masters, read the stuff, think about out of the box and think how, sorry, Laura. But it's, you see, this is the training that we have in academia, even though we, as Karen says, we're constantly checking our own knowledge and our own frameworks by talking to practitioners in the field. Your question about Delhi is very difficult too. But I think in a way it's also to do with mindsets. I think people assume that, as Nick was saying, mobility has to come first rather than people and rather than the planet and rather than the region and environment. And it's a matter of just switching priorities in many ways. The theory will have to be Daniel.
Do you want to say something about theory, Nick?
I can say a bit. I'll say a little. I'll be very quick. Older people in research, your question, I think this is a really interesting one. I think the more I look at this, the more I think we have to look at people on the edges. So we've got into a habit over the last 100 years or so of trying to create what we call a normal distribution. It's very interesting. The word normal actually was only used in that context from about 1890. For that, it meant a right angle, and it became kind of made into this important thing, basically through Fisher and his seeds out in Hertfordshire, and trying to create normality for these seeds. And now it's become this sort of thing, and you can argue about p-values and all sorts of things about things at the end, but actually, the people that are really critical to something like living in the city are the people who are actually on those outer edges. People with neurodiversity, older people, children. Some, it's difficult. I would include women because they're often ignored, and so therefore, in that sense, they are out there, but crucially not. And I think none of these people are on the outside. Actually, they are central to how we design a system. And if we can design a system that works for those people, it will work for the people who do not have those characteristics. And so I think that there are. Actually, I would have the opposite view. I would say we need to be working on these things, because only by looking at their issues can we actually understand where the failures of the system are. And it's only by looking at the failures of the system that we begin to understand how we can fix it. So I think it's really, really important.
Last word of wisdom.
Last word, I don't know about wisdom, but it's the discussion, and particularly Nick's intervention, reminded me of our dear colleague Michael Safier, who recently died, and a number of us had a memorial in his honor. And I think that what you're talking about, Nick, is always to start with what Michael used to call conviviality. If we start with an aim of trying to create convivial cities, which was what he called them, then I think if we ask ourselves, what kind of city do we want to live in? What is a convivial city? Then anything to do with movement and many other things will come out of that. In other words, let's start where it matters. And that's why, from our point of view, we added that fourth dimension in our transport justice definition to operationalize it. In any discussion of justice, you'll always see the equitable distribution. You'll often see the political participation. Increasingly today, since the early 90s, you will also see questions of recognition. But in more recent times, we've come to value much, much more that fourth dimension of mutual care and solidarity, which is so fundamental to our good lives, the good lives that we lead. And I think, by way of conclusion, I would like to say, let's not forget that dimension in all the work we do, because that's really a valuable starting point for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.